Today, we're going to be talking about, I'm going to give a brief introduction. I'm a professor of environmental studies and sciences at Santa Clara University here and a co-founder of the Environmental Justice and Common Good Initiative. And I've had the pleasure of working with this awesome team of student advocates and scholars. And so they're kind of the main feature here, but there's a number of different projects we've been working on together. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to agroecology and food systems change to try to mirror what we actually put in the title here. And then I want to go ahead and move. We're going to have Chloe Gentile-Montgomery and Ben Grundy talk about student food security and food sovereignty at Santa Clara. And then we're going to talk about food system procurement and a sustainability assessment of food systems and the possibilities for food system change at universities using a case study here. And then we'll get into a diversification of smallholder coffee farmer study, focusing more, both the second one focuses more on climate mitigation, and the last one focuses a bit more on adaptation and building climate resilience. And then we'll come back to some takeaways and actions that people can take. So some of our goals are really to start unpacking these relationships, connecting food systems to climate change and environmental justice, and hopefully to inspire some action for building food sovereignty and really thinking about both mitigation and adaptation together, but also the student and individual experience of co-learning and conducting critical yet engaged research that really deals with the obstacles and opportunities for both incremental, but I think we're getting very clearly to the point where transformational changes are what are called for. So let's just get into it, a couple of basic definitions. You know, food is an incredible topic. I know there's other presentations on this today from Winona LaDuke and a previous day, I think in tUrn as well. It connects people, markets, and values, right? But importantly, it connects us to planet and all of these different, you can see from this diagram from Oxford, right? They've got, climate, food relates to 20 to 30% of climate emissions, a huge, 30 to 40% of water sources that are used for irrigation. So there's some significant environmental impacts. Of course, climate also comes back around and affects food production and food security. We see those numbers over here with the people, 800 million hungry, 2 billion overweight. The 800 million is at least 100 million higher right now due to the COVID outbreak and more. But I think perhaps equally as important, at least, is to these materialities are the ethics, the morals, the cultures that are connected to food. And I think that's so important. That's why I was kind of surprised that they put a hamburger in the middle to represent all food. So I thought maybe we could at least put something like a tortilla and a bowl of vegetables that we see in Nicaragua all the time with the farmers we work with, or one of the most common, the most common food that people eat around the world, like a bowl of rice. And as I was describing, you have to be under a log now for quite a while to realize not only is there a climate crisis, but there's major challenges with our food system. We've increasingly, from an incredibly diverse system, moved towards a very kind of uniform industrialized agricultural system. And yet now for decades, and particularly in the last decade, there's growing calls from both farmers, advocates, but researchers and policymakers to move once again from uniformity towards more diversified production to address some of these persistent challenges, from the climate emissions to the 2 billion people suffering micronutrient deficiencies and needing increased access to fresh fruit and vegetables in their diets. There's multiple ways of assessing the impacts of the food on the environment. This was an article that was published, I believe, in Nature a couple years ago, 2017. This diagram, what you see here are some of the, estimates. It's because we don't know for sure where these limits lie, but we know in some cases when we're moving beyond the sort of the ability of the atmosphere or the ability of the or the loss of genetic diversity for the earth to replenish itself. And what you see here in the dotted lines, those show us the influence of agriculture and sort of pushing like nitrogen, pushing us beyond the limits of the natural capacity to absorb nitrogen emissions and nitrogen flow into the environments, right? Or freshwater use. So you see agriculture has a huge footprint. That's the takeaway here. And then, of course, even from our own local system, these conditions have been exacerbated not only by the pre-existing social inequalities. We know that for many people, the food system was broken in many ways before COVID hit, and climate change has been turning the heat up on this for a while now. And yet, we see that it has been significantly exacerbated. Here's just some data from our own neighborhood here in San Jose and and the Silicon Valley. We saw, for example, record unemployment levels, higher food prices, and increased hunger. Work with food pantries and food banks. So they've reported going doubling or sometimes tripling the number of people and families that are served. What are some responses? One response that many colleagues inspired from indigenous traditions and integration with Western science approaches is agroecology, which aims to integrate social sciences, ecology, agronomy, and local and indigenous and implicit knowledge to either develop, and there's different variants and interpretations. The interpretation that I take with many colleagues and scholars and farmers and social movement leaders is trying to move towards a more participatory, transdisciplinary, participatory, bottom-up, action-oriented approach to changing food systems. There's other variants that are focused more on kind of really focusing on ecology and agronomy and making production systems a little bit more efficient, coming up with specific recommendations to decrease environmental impacts, all of which are important, but don't necessarily address the political and the social justice components of this. So this is why the definition that we draw from in agroecology and our shared work here really aligns with this normative goal of a more transformative action, and also brings together not only scholars doing research, but social movement leaders. Agroecology has emerged as a major social movement demand for, like, Via Campesina, one of the biggest social movements worldwide, representing hundreds of millions of farmers, fisherfolk, indigenous people, because they realize it's a way of gaining a stronger foothold and more control, not only in the food is on their plates, but in the agricultural and food systems that shape such a big portion of their lives. So this brings us to this question: are we going to be talking, and we'll be talking about today, business as usual approaches, or backsliding, even no change at all, or what are the possibilities for more transformative changes that could significantly remake and rethink our relationships with each other, with nature, and some of our food systems. This is an example of a little bit of a linear diagram, but I think it gives us a little bit of a vocabulary for thinking about this. A couple of years ago, a number of scholars, and really in part because of civil society demands, worked with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization to kind of institutionalize some of the definitions. And they came up with these 10 elements, which I won't go through in painstaking detail. But these are some of the key elements of agroecology that need to work together towards food system diversification, transformation, and then also drawing on some of Gleesman's work, some levels of change, from more incremental levels like increasing efficiency, replacing, for example, a more toxic pesticide with a less toxic pesticide, kind of level 1, to really starting to reconnect consumers and eaters and growers through food system transformation on level 4 or level 5. And just to be clear, the goal here is to advance some of these food system changes to address the historic and consistent injustices. We know that, as we heard in the acknowledgements in the beginning, these patterns from colonialism to slavery and onward to Jim Crow, they play out in our food system as well, right? And so inequality is common. Even the goal of equality is not enough. Many of us are really trying to work towards equity, and beyond that, towards justice, where the fences of division are merged, and there's a space for all to benefit from the fruits of nature. So what do we mean by food justice? It's in our title. There's lots of different definitions, and a leading sort of agricultural research institute talks about food justice as the right of communities everywhere to produce, process, distribute, and access and eat good food regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, and citizenship. That's a pretty powerful definition. Some of our local partners here from La Mesa Verde, from Sacred Heart Community Services, they worked with their community members, many backyard Latinx gardeners here in San Jose, and they came up with this definition, right? It happens in community, when in community we exercise our right. Now notice the rights framing, right? To sell and eat, to grow, sell, eat, and eat culturally appropriate, fresh, nutritious, and accessible food, while caring for the well-being of the earth, workers, and animals. And we used this definition in a workshop we organized right before COVID stopped us from getting together in person. And this goes very much hand in hand with the global calls for food sovereignty. This really kind of emerged as social movement organizing in the South, and it's establishing similar to the rights-based languages It might have more of a transformative potential for taking on sort of the control of highly consolidated corporations and shaping the markets and the food systems in which which many of us eat and participate. And so these movements, these ideas emerge out of dialogues between social movement leaders, farmers practicing, and some engaged scholars. And we aim to use agroecology to advance food justice and food sovereignty. And the tool for putting these together is often community-based participatory action research, in which our goals for the research are codifying with community-based partners or local institutional partners that may not be embedded in a specific marginal community. Their ideas inform our study design, as well as, of course, the scientific standards, and often are involved in data collection, analyzing the data. A lot of our students have been spending a lot of time doing that. You'll see some of those results. Sharing results back to those that shared the data with us initially, and using this to plan action to improve, ideally move towards not only incremental, but potentially more transformative food system changes. Some of our partners are small scale farmer cooperatives, university research, university units working on student basic needs, farmers, and others. And all of this is held together because of trust and the construction of mutual understanding and mutual accountability. So that's plenty to get us started. You guys are going to be hearing from a talented group of students. I want to let you guys each introduce yourselves in your own words, but I have to say it's been a pleasure working with each of you this last year, some case 2 or 3 years on different parts of this project, of several projects. And I really want to let them tell their own story and encourage you at the end to ask questions about, they have awesome plans for going into the future, how they've supported not only this research, but supported each other. So I really support the co-mentoring that's happened among the student team as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton over to Chloe and Ben, who are going to talk about student food security and food sovereignty at Santa Clara.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. So my name is Chloe Gentile Montgomery, and I am a senior double majoring in environmental science and ethnic studies. And then Ben, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Ben. I'm also senior, and I'm also double majoring in environmental science and political science.
Awesome. And we're presenting our research project on food security here at SCU, just to give a little bit more of a local perspective. All right, so people often make jokes about college students surviving off of ramen noodles and free food without looking at this as a larger institutional problem and nationwide problem, wherein 38% of college students at four-year institutions are experiencing food insecurity. And with that, we also know that COVID-19 has significantly exacerbated these rates. And on top of that, these challenges are heightened by persistent patterns of racial and economic disparities among students, as well as social stigmas that limit discussions of potential responses, as well as discussions among students, making this a really important issue to highlight in research. So these graphs are from the HOPE report, which again studied food security at four-year public universities across the United States. And SU has yet to do this kind of a study. However, these studies have shown that there is a disparity between white and Black students when it comes to basic needs. And basic needs are basically food and housing security. And since the pandemic began, this disparity has actually increased. So before we get more into our presentation, Ben is going to walk us through a little activity.
Yeah, so just to gain a little bit of context as to how our audience is understanding food insecurity and food security in general, we created a poll everywhere. So if people will text code BenGrundy331, I tried to change the code but couldn't, but if you text that to the number 22333, or if you just type in pollev.com/BenGrundy331, we will activate 3 questions just to sort of gauge how our audience would respond to these questions. So the first question is going to be food insecurity means, and then you'll have an opportunity to type in what food insecurity means to you. And we're just looking to gather some general information. So if people would like to do that, that would be great. And then as we go, I can start sharing some of those responses as we get them.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ben, will you go ahead and put that in the chat as well?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Oops. All right, So again, this graph to the right is from the HOPE report, but food insecurity also poses threats to students' educational success as well as their overall well-being and health. So when you're not getting a nutritious diet, your physical health often suffers. And on top of that, when you are food insecure, your mental health is often suffering as well, from issues such as anxiety and depression, just from not knowing where your next meal is coming from. Additionally, both of these physical and mental health can lead to grade suffering, which can cause further issues for a student, especially if they're on scholarship, as a lot of scholarships have a GPA requirement. So if you fall below that GPA requirement and lose your funding, it could be likely that you would withdraw from SCU, and that's not something we ever want to see happen. And overall, when a student body is more food insecure, it impacts completion and retention rates, which we also don't want to see happen here at SCU. And again, this problem has not been systematically studied at Santa Clara University prior to this research project. So with that in mind, we decided to study these 3 research questions. What are the current levels of student food and basic needs security? And are there demographic disparities here at SCU? What are student perceptions regarding the current campus food system? And what lessons can be learned and shared from student food security initiatives that have worked to support students at other Jesuit universities in the US? And so we wanted to ask these questions just to sort of bridge this gap in the research that we noticed there was here at SCU.
Yeah, and to pursue those answers, we followed that community-based participatory action research cycle that Dr. Bacon mentioned earlier and established 3 main research goals. So the first being to assess impacts of COVID-19 on SCU food security, to raise awareness for the existing food assistance programs on campus, and then to recommend methods for creating a more just campus. And to do this, we implemented the use of student surveys to assess food security, as well as a variety of focus groups and then follow-up interviews and some additional conversations with other Jesuit schools to see how they are handling food insecurity on their campuses. And then we moved on to the data collection process. So through those various methods of gathering the information, so those surveys and interviews, we began to collect data, about 558 survey responses, and then an additional 25 or so interviews to follow up, and then an additional amount of focus groups. And after analyzing that initial data, we coded our survey responses and identified some key phrases, and then we transcribed those interview questions and interview responses to, I guess, gain a better picture of what students on campus are actually saying about their ability to have access to food and take control of their own food choices. And after that, we decided to create presentations in order to share this information, not only with our community partners, which is the SCU Food Insecurity Program, but also other Jesuit institutions, to just share and foster a better sense of community across all universities.
Great. And from that survey of 558 graduate and undergraduate students here at SCU, we found that 19% of respondents were considered to be food insecure, having either low or very low food security scores. And these scores were calculated using the number of times a respondent answered yes to a series of 10 questions regarding their relationship to food in the past 30 days. So 102 students had food insecurity, and an additional 58 or 10% are at risk of becoming food insecure, having marginal food security. So what's really concerning about these numbers, despite aside from them being so high, is that less than 30% of respondents are aware of the SCU food insecurity program. And then within this group of students that was labeled as food insecure based on our survey, Hispanic students were more likely to self-report food insecurity while having attended SCU, and students that identified as Black, Latinx, or Pacific Islander were also most likely to be food insecure. So we were seeing very similar disparities that the HOPE Lab survey saw nationwide, which is really concerning. Additionally, we saw that graduate students were more likely to experience food insecurity than undergraduate students, and that more than 25% of students that identified as food insecure were completely unaware of the SCU food insecurity program. So this means that not only were they dealing with this food insecure, but they were dealing with it completely without any support from the university, and often felt as though they were completely on their own with this.
And in addition to looking at levels of food insecurity on our campus, we also looked at levels of housing insecurity and found that about 31% of respondents reported experiencing some level of housing insecurity within the last 12 months. And of that 31%, 14% of those respondents experienced both food and housing insecurity. And then in all, just due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had about 29% of respondents report a change in their housing situation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in just analyzing our interviews, we decided to, I guess, take some key quotes and highlight some of the issues that students felt revolved around food insecurity. So there was a lot of mention of there being a stigma just because people felt that they were vulnerable and that because food is inherently tied to your class status, people were unwilling to share that they didn't have access to food out of fear of being judged for not having the means to support themselves. There was also a lot of conversations surrounding just mental health and different eating disorders, which aren't necessarily a matter of access, but just a matter of support and having access to those resources. But also through these conversations, we gained an understanding of how students are interacting with SCU's meal system. And there were a lot of interesting suggestions about how Santa Clara can move forward in helping students better move towards food sovereignty, such as maybe looking at readjusting the meal point system, as there's a general trend of students running out of meal points before the end of the quarter. So once you reach that stressful period of finals week, there's often a lot of students that don't have points to access food in our dining halls. And then in terms of some concluding takeaways of incremental and transformational changes that can be made, first, we recommend that there's an increased and permanent amount of funding that is given to the SCU Food Security Program, which is home to the Bronco Food Pantry, in order to increase support for students in need. We also think that there should be a campaign to increase student awareness of food-related assistance, whether that's through a food statement on your class syllabus or through a section on food resources during first-year orientation sessions. We also think that there should be an increase in the amount of donations made to the food pantry and the amount of points that students can donate to the food pantry at the end of the quarter, rather than having that amount be capped. And we also believe that there should be a yearly assessment of basic needs on campus, similar to this one, just to ensure that Santa Clara has an active pulse of how their students are dealing with various access to resources on campus.
Yeah, and while those incremental changes are really important, we also want to advocate for some more transformational changes. And these include increasing student financial aid packages and increasing the estimated cost of attendance, so that if there are any hidden fees associated with coming to SU, that can be covered by their financial aid, and students don't have to dip into their food budget in order to be able to afford the cost of attendance here. Additionally, we strongly encourage SCU to reassess their relationship with Bon Appetit, because when it comes to meeting diverse students' needs, they are not meeting the mark. We found that the meal point system often leaves students experiencing food insecurity at the end of the quarter, and there's not a lot of flexibility in adjusting that meal point system as long as we have the contract with Bon Appetit. Additionally, students of color often mentioned that the cultural foods available at Bon Appetit are not representative of their actual culture, and they also feel as though because Bon Appetit has a monopoly on our university, they have no other choice but to eat there. And kind of in line with that, students are also really disappointed with the treatment of workers by Bon Appetit. But again, because Bon Appetit has a monopoly on the university, students are then forced to support a system that they don't believe is ethical, and this kind of takes away from their food justice and food sovereignty based on the definitions given by Dr. Bacon before. So reassessing our relationship with Bon Appetit, and then also rewriting housing contracts to provide year-long contracts for students that may not have a stable living situation back home, because a lot of housing insecurity surrounds the summer and break times when housing contracts are broken by SU. And also, we hope that SU can create an emergency housing plan so that students don't have to be kicked off of campus in the event that there is another pandemic like COVID. So yeah, thank you for listening. And we're going to hear from Emma and Paige next.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chloe and Ben.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good transition into talking about Bon Appetit.
So yeah, I'm Emma. I'm a senior here at Santa Clara, and my major is actually bioengineering.
And then I just recently graduated from Santa Clara. I'm Paige, and I studied integrative biology. So I started in cellular stuff and worked my way up to environmental here.
Awesome. So this work started as a fellowship through the Center for Sustainability at Santa Clara. Both Paige and I were hired to conduct an audit of the campus food purchases, so Bon Appetit's campus food purchases. This was a lot of digging through, as you can see in this image, a lot of digging through invoices, electronic and paper. We ended up analyzing over 11,000 line items of data. The purpose of the audit was to both to complete the annual calculator for something called the Real Food Challenge, and then also to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from our campus food system. And since we completed this audit, we have been continuing to do some analysis of the data. So we actually gave a presentation shortly following the completion of our analysis at tUrn, and we've been continuing to work with this data. But for some background, the Real Food Challenge is the national organization that harnesses the power of institutional food purchasing to promote equity and sustainability in food systems. Food is considered real by the Real Food Challenge if it qualifies for one or more of 4 categories. Those categories are local, ecologically sound, fair trade, and humane. And their standards are fairly rigorous. I won't go over them, but you can find them on their website, realfoodchallenge.org, if you're interested. Thank you. And then for the climate emissions analysis, I'm going to do a really brief science lesson here. The greenhouse gas effect. This describes the way that heat trapping gases enclose radiation from the sun that's near the Earth's atmosphere. And yeah, so there's a great degree to which this is normal, and we take advantage of this in agriculture through greenhouses. And also, thankfully, our planet is not as cold as it is in space. But the problem is that, go forward one more click. When humans emit too many of those heat trapping gases, the planet starts to heat up because of the atmosphere. And these greenhouse gases that I've been referring to, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, also methane, ozone, and chlorofluorocarbons, our food system produces some of these as well. So just wanted to give a quick overview of that. So this is what when we talk about carbon footprint, that's the collective greenhouse gas from the equivalent carbon dioxides of all the greenhouse gases that are emitted from the activities of an organization. On the flip side, nitrogen footprint. This is something that is not discussed very often, but this is a collective weight of reactive elemental nitrogen that's released into the atmosphere. And it's not the same thing as a carbon footprint because you can't convert between elemental nitrogen and carbon dioxide equivalents. There is one elemental nitrogen that is considered a carbon or a greenhouse gas, but that's just one. And the consequences of the other emissions of elemental nitrogen are also can be catastrophic. In this image here, you see a common occurrence in agriculture is there'll be excess nitrogen fertilizer. It will either run off or leach into the ocean, and that creates something called dead zones, which you've probably heard of, or eutrophication. Other issues are biodiversity loss and acid rain. So the reason that I explained all that is to kind of give an overview of why we cared about calculating the carbon emissions and nitrogen emissions from our campus food system. And we used SciMap to do this, which is basically a platform that uses weight and ingredient data to calculate carbon and elemental nitrogen emissions. And then after analysis, we wanted to make recommendations to Bon Appetit that would both improve the real food percentage at SU and decrease our climate emissions. Since Bon Appetit is ultimately a full for-profit company, we did include an estimated change in the cost of our recommended changes. And we'll share these as product shift scenarios, which this means that SU might choose to purchase fair trade coffee brand instead of a conventional brand, and no endorsements for either one of these products. This is just an example. Or we might choose to purchase a greater percentage of plant-based protein, like organic pinto beans, or instead of chicken from a concentrated animal feeding operation.
Cool. So after going through those 11,000 lines of data and inputting them through both the Real Food Challenge and SciMap, we had to ultimately do something with those metrics and kind of reach valuable conclusions that could be used to both provide recommendations to try and improve Bon Appetit's practices, and just to kind of explain and communicate the state of the university's food system and the impacts that it's having both socially and environmentally on this community and the broader global community. And what we found ultimately was that our real food percentage was 21.68% in 2018 and 2019. And this is the third time we've done this particular analysis, and it's improved each time. So hopefully that's a good sign. This indicates that our university food system is becoming more socially sustainable, at least, because the Real Food Challenge evaluates performance according to metrics such as organic and local and fair trade, things that are more tied to the practice of social engagement in a food market necessarily than the emissions of growing a specific thing. So this is a good sign that our real food percentage is increasing. And we also found that the Real Food Challenge is kind of a great vehicle just for communicating food systems impacts and change strategies to a wide variety of actors. The Center for Sustainability's proposal in and of itself is a mechanism for involving students and kind of starting this discussion about food system impacts in the classroom and in faculty spaces. And the tool also provides more formal mechanisms for traction, things that get signed by university actors, and the implementation of groups that kind of bring together people from across the system to talk about the best ways to change it.
And then on the emission side, for the 2018 to 19 academic year, which is the last year we were able to do this analysis, SU's carbon emissions were around 4,700 metric tons of carbon dioxide. For context, which this might not provide a whole lot of context, but that's equivalent to the carbon dioxide emissions that would be released when over 526,000 gallons of gas are burned. And significantly, because we have to eat, right? But significantly, 81.3% of these come from animal sources. And so cheese, dairy, meats, fish, all that. And then on the nitrogen side of things, 63.5 metric tons of nitrogen. It's hard to kind of put context to that because we don't really talk about nitrogen emissions very often, but about 89% of those come from animal-based products. And so then if we look at the scenario calculations that we've been working on, we looked at switching milk to real qualifying vendor, which would be a local vendor, some different fair trade impacts and sourcing from medium and local farms. Significantly replacing animal-based protein with real food qualifying plant-based protein. So organic or fair trade plant-based proteins, whether that's 14, 50, or 100% of your animal-based protein has favorable outcomes in all three of the metrics that we used in this case. So that means it increases real food percentage, decreases climate emissions, and also represents a cost savings to the Bon Appetit and also likely to the students. So there also are some limitations, of course, in these metrics, but that was what came out of this analysis.
Yeah, we also kind of left this analysis with a list of things to hand to Bon Appetit and say, these are some good choices for you to try and improve your practices in the food system. And I won't go too deep into these because we've shared these a couple times. We shared these last year at tUrn, but some easy options that we provided to Bon Appetit were choosing more local and organic bakery items, as well as trying to increase our fair trade purchasing of some international traded items such as coffee, sugar, and tea, and ensuring that we source all of our dairy and meat products from humane operations. And then a big one that is easy for individuals to implement as well is reducing the purchasing and consumption of these highly processed conventional snack foods. Just maybe get some carrots instead of some Cheetos. And then we also kind of left with these more, to use the framework of incremental versus transformative. We kind of left with these more transformative recommendations to hopefully kind of bring Bon Appetit into this realm of trying to remedy the broader issues of food insecurity as well as environmental impacts while still being an economic entity. So to kind of zoom out a little bit, we recommend that the Center for Sustainability and Bon Appetit continue with this project and try to keep fostering collaboration both between those institutions, but between other facets of the university food systems. For instance, the work that Chloe and Ben just discussed regarding food insecurity is information that could be brought to these kind of multi-stakeholder food systems discussions. And we think that would be a great thing to do moving forward. We also kind of left with, I guess these could be called like process insights regarding the usefulness of combining SciMap, which is highly technical about the numbers, about the carbon emissions, and the Real Food Challenge, which is more about these kind of social third-party certifications. And we definitely did run into some hurdles, as any research project might. Integrating two separate metrics like this it can be cumbersome, depending on how many line items you have and what your goal is. And both tools have inherent assumptions. We assume that these third-party certifications are accurate. We assume that SciMap's calculation is accurate. But I want to focus on the benefits instead. I want to focus on kind of this right side here of using both SciMap, which puts things in terms of CO2, a metric that makes sense to people who speak money, people who interact with these like international networks, as well as with the Real Food Challenge, which is metrics that make sense to people, the organic food that you buy. So together, these kind of serve to connect individual choices to this like broader systemic change and systemic movements.
If you all want to drop some of your thoughts in the chat about ways that you might be able to yourself support sustainable and ethical food systems, they kind of move a little bit from like the incremental, which is super important, to the more transformational ones. But this idea of shifting your purchasing would be replacing some of your animal-based proteins with plant-based proteins, purchasing in-season produce from your local farmers market or CSA, and then the last would be involving yourself in local food systems-based advocacy, of which there are lots of examples on the bottom. But I think,
yeah. And I think we're getting short on time here, but this kind of last wrap up, we will revisit a little bit as we kind of conclude from our third presentation here about Chris's work in Nicaragua. But kind of one of the overall themes that we're trying to show with all of these projects is that incremental changes are important. Making good decisions within the existing system is very important. But also we do need to be aware of and work towards these transformational changes where instead of just making a different choice within the system, we change which system we interact with or change how we interact with the system. And I'll stop talking now. I'm going to pass it off to Chris for our third presentation.
Thank you so
thank
much
you to everyone.
Thank you. Yes. As you can see here, there's a lot of collaborators on this. Special call out to Lindsay Kalkbrenner for all of her work supporting this getting started, and including some support from the administration that's very involved and interested in this, and cooperation from Bon Appetit. Now so I think a big piece of what Emma and Paige were talking about so well was the mitigation of the negative impacts and also building some of these more positive potential through the Real Food Challenge. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on adaptation and diversification among smallholder coffee farms. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we're really going to talk about some of the student research components analyzing the data. This is part of a much broader project that included 2 farmer cooperatives, one in Nicaragua and one Prodecoop, and one in Mexico, here up in Chiapas, Mexico, agricultural universities in both countries, University of Vermont, Santa Clara, Community Agroecology Network. And we started out by really looking about, people have been talking about diversification as an alternative to these challenges of food insecurity, climate disruptions, impact on coffee farmers for a long time, right? Probably ever since we started introducing some of the things like coffee in the first place, right? And so, but there's been millions, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in diversification, particularly with smallholder farmers. But there's still not a clear understanding among many of these farmers, their allies, even their local co-ops and organizations, which forms of diversification are most likely to contribute to food security. How does that relate to gender equity? And could it be part of building climate resilience in more specific terms? This ends up being a gap in the literature in terms of understanding around agroecology, which often promotes diversification as good. But what types work and for whom? When are there trade-offs? Those types of questions are not always unpacked. So we set out to do this in a long-term collaborative project using participatory action research. I'm not going to be able to tell you all the pieces here, but it was really going to initially be a 3-year project with those different team members. We signed agreements with teams working in Mexico and Nicaragua. This is the sort of inception meetings in both countries. You can see going up in the screen now. There's some really powerful farmer to farmer and co-op to co-op and youth exchanges when we brought leaders from Mexico to Nicaragua to learn, and then from Nicaragua up to Mexico to learn. And there's been publications and a couple of PhD students at the University of Vermont. There's been awesome undergrad students here at Santa Clara University involved, and over 30 undergrad students and 3 master's students with the Agroecology University in Nicaragua, and many other publications that are in the works. And through these times, we see multiple hazards, including political unrest in April of 2018 in Nicaragua, the pandemic, and just recently in November, we saw back-to-back hurricanes, Eta and Iota, hit Nicaragua, some of the most severe hurricanes to ever hit that late in the season, a prediction that's associated with a warming climate. Some really important actions taken by co-ops in Nicaragua and in both Mexico, like Seed Guardians and farmer producer experimenters, and other actions that we'll talk more about by the co-op partner in Nicaragua. All of this rooted in this cyclical process of research and action. So just like we have this awesome youth team here at Santa Clara, these are some of the young people involved and conducting the surveys, doing farm inventories, and much more in Nicaragua. So we're connected in more than one way. And, perhaps not surprisingly, one of our initial findings is this correlation between these months, percentage of participants reporting. This was a survey of 172 farmers. Want to also give a call out to Vanessa Shin, who did her honors thesis on this work and initially had a chance to go to Nicaragua through Johnson Scholars Program. What we see here is the common pattern of June, July, and August being reported as lean months among the surveyed farmers. And this, not surprisingly, correlates with agricultural calendars, including precipitation. Nice precipitation hydrograph here due to some collaborative work with Ira Stewart-Fry. We see the rainy season starting in May and June, right when this lean season before the first harvest comes in, when the money has ran out for many farmers, and a dip in a midsummer drought here, and then another peak in October. And also this correlates with the different activities. There's a vacation, so students aren't getting food at schools during July. That's pretty common. And the cropping seasons, which we won't get into too much detail here. And not surprisingly, in doing some analysis with my colleague, Bill Sundstrom, who we've done a lot of work together with over the years, we actually pulled together the data for basic corn and bean prices in Nicaragua. And we found at that same time, these June, July, and August, where farmers are reporting where food insecurity, when it's more difficult to access food, the prices of corn are spiking, right? They're almost 20% above their average. Prices of bean are a little bit higher at that time too. And so this is a moment when there's a real pinch in farmer livelihoods. We unpack that and link it to water security in a lot more detail in a recent publication that just came out a couple of weeks ago. With this particular study, we also found some correlations linking on-farm diversity, the number of crops that were planted, with dietary diversity inside the households. And this is really significant because it gets at that 2 billion person problem of people not eating enough fresh fruits and vegetables and growing more on the farm, perhaps not surprisingly, but you have to always look at the evidence correlated with more diverse diets. We also saw shorter periods of seasonal hunger, those lean months associated with larger farm areas and a little bit of a higher income, which is particularly important. I'm going to go ahead and pass, before I pass it on, just remind us that we're in this multiple hazard environment, which is nothing new for Central America, right? From hurricanes and coffee pathogens like the coffee leaf rust to droughts, to spikes in prices and political unrest, and then more hurricanes in this most recent time. But now also California is a multi-hazard environment. In some of our own work, we're talking about wildfires during a pandemic, right? So we really need to look for strategies to build resilience under these circumstances. And that's exactly what we did with one of the surveys focusing on coffee farming. And our alumni, Skylar, did some of the important coding analysis of this work, and I'll let her take it over.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and for listening. My name is Skylar. I graduated from SU last year with studies, and now I'm working in Chico, California as a Civic Spark AmeriCorps fellow working on climate planning, affordable housing, and fire recovery. And now with that background that Dr. Bacon just gave, I'll dive into some of the results from the resilience component the Nicaragua study, where our partners in Nicaragua co-created and distributed surveys to 34 farmers. And then a big part of my role on the team has been cleaning and analyzing the results in our studio and accounting for new data as it comes in. So what you're looking at here in the graphic on the left is specialized coffee production, which looks more like the leftmost portion. That's more sparse and grown under just partial shade from fruit trees, whereas diversified coffee production looks more like the bird-friendly area on the right with more diverse shade and a canopy at a couple of different levels. And the graph next to it on the right shows farm resilience scores over 3 different components of resilience. So exposure variables, which stem from questions like, have you noticed irregular rain patterns in recent years of drought? Impact variables, questions like, have you noticed damages to your coffee plantation from pests and diseases increasing? And adaptive capacity, which are questions like whether or not organic fertilizers have been applied or whether coffee plants are older than 15 years and so on. And the results from the farmers' responses to these questions are compiled in the rightmost 2 bars in their overall resilience score, which shows diversified farms scoring higher on the resilience scale than farmers who specialize in just coffee. And this box plot shows the difference in farm resilience scores by whether a farm is conventional or organic. And since most often organic farms are also diversified, while specialized farms are often conventional, the graph showing resilience score by farmers diversified or not is practically identical. And so those are some of the results. What are some of the solutions to help farmers with lower resilience scores? Well, 5 of the most common recommendations of the complete list of 57 based on how farmers responded are the 5 listed here on the left, and most of them pertain to both adaptation and mitigation, while only the last one just pertains to adaptation. And then the bar chart on the right shows the top 5 categories that most farmers struggle with, which correlates the types of recommendations that we'll send to them to help them develop their 5-year farm resilience plans. And that about wraps up my remarks. So I'll pass it to Gabby to talk about diversification and gender implications.
Thanks, Skylar. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby, and I'm a senior, double majoring in environmental studies and Italian studies. And a lot of my work has consisted of working on the literature review and looking at the gender relations in association with diversification strategies. So what I've learned through the literature review is that there are a lot of benefits that come from implementing diversification strategies, such as soil fertility, pest management, climate resilience, and a lot of other benefits that overall help farmers to help manage risk and minimize environmental hazards. But I've also found that there are many limitations to diversification strategies in terms of the fact that women often have a lack of access to resources, training, and control over their land and income, which are really important in their ability to adapt to climate change and important to their food security status. So women are also faced with what's called either the double or triple burden, in which they're expected to both work and be the primary caregivers of their children. And this becomes known as the triple burden when they're faced with work, providing for their children, and also having to implement these new diversification strategies. So it's especially burdensome to implement these new strategies as they often are excluded from agricultural or agroecological trainings, or have a lack of access to these trainings. And so women are beginning to gain access to diversification related trainings. However, their voices are often still suppressed. And as Dr. Bacon mentioned before, agroecology can not only be viewed as a set of ecological processes, but it could also be seen as a principles-based approach that examines how to achieve social justice. So agroecology allows for us to examine food security, dietary diversity, and climate resilience through a gendered perspective. And this gendered perspective is essential in understanding how to address some of these gender inequalities and inequities within diversification strategies. So when examining the literature review, I found that these two articles in particular show the burdens that women face within the agricultural sector. They both look at how gender norms along with institutions greatly affect the type of work that women take part in and what they have access to. So the first article that you can see here, Maternal Resources and Household Food Security Evidence from Nicaragua, it talks about the expectations that women face of being caregivers for their children, along with having to work at the same time while not receiving the adequate support that they need. So again, that's a double or triple burden that they're facing. And then the second article talks about how women often don't have access to the agricultural training that they need to improve their livelihoods, and in order to understand how to implement practices that also build their resilience. And I'll pass it on to Erica.
Hi, so yeah, my name is Erika Martinez, and I'm an alumni. I graduated. I majored in public health, biology, and Spanish, and with Dr. Bacon here, I worked on, so based on what Gabby found in the literature review, we performed a document in which we used the annual reports from 2011 to 2019 of the co-op that Dr. Bacon is partnered with in Nicaragua. And from these reports, we gathered all the trainings listed as well as the gender breakdown. On the report seen on the right, you can see the training name on the left column, and then the total number of participants as well as the female and male composition that we used for this analysis. And so these trainings were then coded based on a concise code list that we categorized based on their main theme. And we focused particularly on the analysis of the female and male participation of the gender-related and the diversification-related theme trainings. And to analyze the significance of the data, we performed various chi-square tests and a reverse calculation to ensure the validity. So our chi-square tests for independence demonstrated that there was a significant association between gender-related trainings and sex, which is represented by the greater female attendance in the gender-related trainings compared to all other trainings, which is depicted here in figure 1A, where you can see that the female attendance in gender-related trainings is nearly 70% compared to an approximately 35% in all other trainings. Similarly, the relationship between diversification-related trainings and sex was also statistically significant and is depicted in figure 1B. However, this was observed by a lower presence of females in diversification-related trainings compared in which it was a nearly 30% related female attendance, compared to 40% respectively. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that the goodness of fit chi-square test proved that the data came from different distributions. And so to understand what these results mean, one must take into account that the overall co-op is 35% female, so that should be the baseline attendance. And we also must take into consideration related trainings encompass a variety of like women advocacy, inclusion and equity, domestic violence, women's health, among other things. This can be a likely explanation for the higher presence of women in these trainings. They can feel that these are more relevant to them, or they can feel more comfortable there, or these are the trainings that are mostly promoted to them by the gender program that the co-op has. Gender roles can further help us understand these results, since males can likely feel like these workshops are intended for women, so they don't feel the responsibility to attend. And there could also be this machista machista belief in which they don't support women in such trainings. And moreover, gender roles can also help us explain the lack of female diversification trainings, since men are usually considered the ones doing the hard labor out in the field, and the women are the caregivers, which connects to what Gabby mentioned that she found in the literature review. And lastly, it is also worth mentioning that there's a potential limitation to our results, and that the was reported as binary. Could be some people that don't necessarily identify as such. And I'll pass it back to Dr. Bacon.
So just to wrap up, some of the conclusions of this piece is that, food security remains a challenge, but we found significant positive correlation with dietary diversity and farm diversity. And we just heard that great summary on gender relations, so I don't need to repeat that too much. And the coffee plot, and as that tied into the sophisticated literature review that Gabby did, and coffee plot resilience analysis also showed the importance of diverse shade parcels. But the need, you might have noticed that the adaptive capacity was a little bit lower for organic producers. And there's a big challenge with producing enough organic compost and fertilizers that are to meet the requirements of healthy plants. In terms of future changes, some more incremental changes could be that we've been watching this week, Earth Week, right? And the climate summits convened by President Biden. And there's once again the question about not just mitigation measures and those very important pledges, but there's $100 billion a year that were committed back in the Paris Agreement that's going to be climate adaptation finance, much of that to developing countries. Well, this commitment has not been met. And when it has been even close, it's been mostly through loans. So I would still call this an incremental change, because much of that funding is going through mainstream channels and multilateral organizations that often don't promote the more transformative potential that we see when we see partnerships that link, agroecology with food system localization and diversification, for really farmers taking more power over their local food systems, learning about and negotiating fairer deals for themselves and for their colleagues, and really this potential for change gendered attitudes, and just to recognize men or there's a real need for new forms of masculinity to address these kinds of persistent relationships that perpetuate these inequalities. All right, so this is cool. Now, what can you do? What can I do? Well, first of all, one thing is this: this comes up again. This is taken from the side of a barn in Ireland, I think. But farmers have said this to me as well. Stop calling me resilient, because it means you're going to do something else to harm me, right? We need deeper approaches to resilience. Maybe we don't need to toss the word out, but we really need to think about it in a much deeper way. Some of the evidence we provided hopefully helps us think about that. We could also think about that inner resilience, right? That strength that gives us to carry on. From the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, there's a reminder about the gratitude and the sense that, if we think about each of ourselves as a drop in the ocean of all consciousness, as Kirpal Singh once said, that really opens up a whole new set of relationships, right? Or we respond to Laudato Si, which was read earlier in this activity, thinking about the gratitude and beauty of nature as creation, rejecting the cultures of consumption, and really thinking about a process that reconciles ourselves to our relationships our interiority, our relationships with inside, and our relationships with each other. On more practical, we do have some more incremental and transformative steps. So I want to kick it back to Chloe to remind people of how they might get engaged and some of the takeaways from the first presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, so Ben is going to start us off with some of these incremental changes that y'all can do.
Yeah, there's just a few little quick things. You can donate gift cards to SCU Food Insecurity Program. You can also donate your meal points at any of the different kiosks or stations within Benson. You can volunteer at local food banks. You can donate to food justice organizations that support racial justice and aim to change the system. And you can provide food education and present resources during orientation sessions.
And for some of those more transformational steps, you can support the advocacy with workers on campus movement, and similarly let administration know that you would like to see the contract with Bon Appetit adjusted or broken. Additionally, advocating for increased financial aid for students and donating to existing scholarship funds. I believe one existing scholarship fund is the Black Excellence Scholarship Fund, and also advocating for year-long housing contracts as well as the emergency housing contracts that we mentioned before. And if you want to get involved with food insecurity at SU or learn more about the research, you can contact me at my emails at the bottom, and I'll put it in the chat too.
And then kind of related to food procurement, be a conscious eater and consumer. The incremental changes would be vote with your dollar. I'm sure people have heard that before. Purchasing organic and especially regeneratively grown food, purchasing local food, fair trade, humane food. These are all amazing incremental changes. And also choosing plant forward or plant-based diets. And I'll also say, if you want to get involved with food procurement at SCU, please also, you can contact.
And then a few of the transformational changes that hopefully these increments could culminate in, or you can support movements who are working towards, are rethinking your relationship with your local agricultural organizations and supporting the ones who are growing food justice and food sovereignty in your community, instead of whichever is easiest. This is things like supporting your local farmers market, getting to know the farmers, as well as more political actions such as campaigning and voting for political systems, value systems that support cruelty-free, regenerative, and fair trade food production. This includes things such as the Food Systems Working Group that we mentioned earlier, but it is not by any means limited to that. And I guess just to wrap up, a transformational change how you interact with food. Practice celebrating it instead of just getting it to stay alive. Celebrate it, make time for it, make space for it.
Abby, do you want to take us through these takeaways here?
Sure. So in terms of some incremental actions that we can perform, we could advocate for more climate adaptation finance developing countries, and as well as source more organic and fair trade foods at Santa Clara, but also at home and beyond. And in terms of transformational actions that we can take, we can form participatory action research partnerships with cooperatives using the agroecology framework within diversification strategies and while addressing food sovereignty. And then we can also learn more about and actually try and practice these transformational agroecological practices, and also start cooperatives and or join similar food justice.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody who supported this work.